Press, Alpine Spring Gardens. I like the composition, but it hasn't been helped by your processing options. There is a significant over-sharpening apparent across the photo, and the burning in of the sky is too strong and inconsistent with variable tones of blue where the selection tool or brush has missed the horizon line. 1 point. Not accepted. Curled fern. Fern fronds are a captivating subject requiring strong separation from background and a depth of field where all the fronds are sharp. You have achieved the first of these objectives, but unfortunately not all the fronds are in focus. 1 point. Not accepted. Fagus at Cradle Mt. An interesting if slightly unbalanced composition is not helped by your shutter speed, which has much of the bright foreground vegetation blurred by movement and thus seeming out of focus. The amount of movement blur here is distracting to my eye. 1 point. Not accepted.
Floating along. A wonderful idea not helped by the execution. A simple composition such as this really needs all the feather detail to be in sharp focus, but that is not the case here. Check if you have a depth of field preview button on your camera which can help you see what is in sharp focus. Or check your first shot and adjust your aperture to get it all sharp and shoot again until you have got it. 1 point. Not accepted.
Arkarula. Anne Starkey. You have done well to balance the exposure of the highlights, sky and shadow in this landscape. If you didn't do so, you could have achieved a stronger result with bracketed exposures and an HDR merge in Lightroom. I like your composition. 3 points. Acceptance. Autumn color. Rob Dawkins. Beautifully composed with a lovely balance. Unfortunately, this comes across as underexposed and flat in contrast, with heavy shadow detail. Even in such light you can easily get the autumn leaves to sing with lightening of the yellows, greens and increasing their saturation, found in the HSL tab in the Lightroom Develop module. 3 points. Acceptance. Autumn in the suburbs. Jenny King. As a documentary photograph it captures 3 autumn leaves well. Good light and good exposure, processing help transform an otherwise ordinary scene. 3 points. Acceptance. Great EGRET. Symonds Smith. The EGRET is sharp enough, but we have lost some of the white feather detail so necessary for a bird photograph. The vegetation highlights at the bottom of frame could easily have been cropped out to clean up the photograph without affecting compositional balance. 3 points. Acceptance. Lauries Waterfall No2. Gil Hayes. Lovely tones and feel to this waterfall photograph. The foreground is dominant within the composition, and sets up a bit of visual competition with the waterfall such that my eye cannot rest on the one dominant center of interest. Your technique is good. I hope you were able to find other compositions while you were there. 3 points. Acceptance. Lazy Sunday afternoon. Jenny King. I like the minimalism here, but feel that bit more contrast in the sand area would add some more punch to the photograph overall. 3 points. Acceptance. Morning light. Alan Keeley. Nice Elgith with a slightly confusing composition not helped by the foreground elements that are not adding anything to the wonderfully lit background. 3 points. Acceptance.
Mountain pool. Alan Keeley. I feel that this is slightly unbalanced by the angle of your viewpoint, such that the water pool at the base of the falls is not fully included in the photograph, and there is a feeling of the water running downhill as if the camera wasn't perfectly horizontal. Perhaps a wider angle, or shoot in horizontal format, which would also remove the out-of-focus foreground rock at the creek edge. 3 points. Acceptance.
My name is Finley. Julie Phillips. Finley is a lovely cat, but the shadows and sun highlights are the wrong way around. In any animal study, the light needs to be at the head, face allowing the eyes to sparkle. Given what you had top work worth, you're doing a good job on the shadows. Perhaps you could have cropped out the sunlit body. 3 points. Acceptance. Pandanas at Ronny Creek. Daryl Starkey. Landscape photography benefits from having the best light, contrast on the main subject area, which is not happening here. The soft light hasn't helped, as you have lost the 3D feel that you would have seen with your eyes. Further, the composition would be improved by getting lower and closer to the pandanus to lift their leafy heads above the horizon, thus joining the foreground elements with the sky. 3 points. Acceptance. Pied oyster catchers. Brad's stag. A nice grouping looking for better light. The dark feather details is lost without more contrast from the sun from your processing. 3 points. Acceptance. Reflected beauty. Anne MacDonald. A pleasant landscape, nicely lit generally. I do find the foreground, fringing, grasses to be the best lit part of the photo and a bit uneven at the bottom of the frame. 3 points. Acceptance. Rocky glow. Anne MacDonald. Well exposed generally, if a little underexposed on the rocks. I feel the composition is trying to include too much. I don't think the current balance between rocks and sky is as effective as concentrating on one or the other. 3 points. Acceptance. Triple splash. Stephen Matthews. Lovely shapes, but unfortunately the large top splash cuts the top of frame and is not fully included. This does mess with the overall balance, but once seen, that is where my always settles, missing the color and shapes below. 3 points. Acceptance.
A life lived. Teresa Johnson. I think this illustrates the seriousness with which the competitors are approaching their sport. Well exposed and composed, this photo has gotten more interesting the more I looked at it. 4 points. Highly commended. Autumn foliage. Sharon King. A slice of life where the autumn yellows and greens lift the vibrancy of the photograph. Your composition is effective and renders the human elements to a secondary place in the photo, which is not a bad thing. As always, good light makes the job easier. 4 points. Highly commended. Buff banded rail. Bob Goodwin. I suspect this is a tight crop from a larger, as the depth of field drop-off on the bird is evident. It is still effective because of the good light helping you to make a good portrait of an interesting bird. 4 points. Highly commended. Fungi. Rob Dawkins. A good composition of a beautifully sharp fungus. Light is soft, and arguably a half stop underexposed, but is still suited to the location. No background distractions add to the effectiveness of this photo. 4 points. Highly commended. Goats Bluff. Daryl Starkey. A good coastal landscape, seascape. The pastel tones brought by the soft light have been processed well to give us good tonal range and a sense of depth to the photograph that makes good use of a balanced composition. 4 points. Highly commended. I've had enough. Margaret Sobolewski. Street photography has its own rules where the story can outweigh the technical criteria we often apply to pictorial photography generally. That applies to this photo, where the lack of sharpness on the walking figure could easily be a problem, yet the more I looked at this I felt it didn't detract too much from the story because his emotion has been captured really well. 4 points. Highly commended, light painting on the river. Stephen Matthews. I am not generally a fan of light painting because I have seen too many boring examples of the technique. This one is intriguing in the way that you have painted the tree in the water and captured its reflection within a broader environment. 4 points. Highly commended, Nankeen Heron and Autumn Highlights. Sharon King. A good capture of the Nankeen Night Heron. You have done well to capture it in such lovely light. It's a nice portrait, and apart from the messy foreground stick you have done well, although I would also suggest toning down the highlights which are bordering on overexposure. 4 points. Highly commended. On the Wing. John Morland. Some fun at play here, well envisioned and an ideal title page photo for a fantasy novel perhaps. It is nice to see a photo that has had some thought go into its creation. 4 points. Highly commended, Riding the Wave. John Morland. God, creative effort with a bit much space at the top. I think this would have been stronger as a square or horizontal presentation, allowing more space in front of the craft, and a complete ripple circle at the right-hand side. 4 points. Highly commended, The Station Clock. Margaret Sobolewski. A good cityscape at dusk, helped by the warmth of the light in the sky balancing the artificial lights on the buildings, all helped by a nicely balanced composition. 4 points. Highly commended, Try Some Cheese Sir. Tony Sobolewski. In the style of street photography, all the elements here are a part of the story. If I was to be picky, I hope that you also got the next shot of the cheese being handed to the customers for tasting to strengthen the story further. 4 points. Highly commended, Cold Outside. Anne Starkey. A slice of life captured effectively. Good exposure, color saturation and composition where nothing is extraneous gave this a strong interest from my first viewing. Well seen. I feel that I am in the traffic with you. 6 points. Merit.
Nankeen Kestrel. Brad Stagg. A lovely capture, beautifully sharp with a great, neutral backgrounds totally out of focus. I think this is slightly out of balance with more space behind the bird than ahead of OT, so a slight crop to the right-hand side is all I would suggest. 6 points. Merit, Paul Bennett Pitts Special. Mike Jones. A good action capture at an awkward angle to illustrate the extreme maneuvers seen at an airshow or similar event. Good exposure and panning technique is evident. Well done. 6 points. Merit, Raptor F22 near speed of sound. Mike Jones. Great capture. This just misses out on the top in this set by virtue of the tight composition top and bottom, compared to the lateral space provided left and right. 6 points. Merit, The Railwayman. Tony Sobolewski. A good night scene of the Rayliard and city beyond, made by the inclusion of the Railwayman in that clear space at the bottom of the frame. Well done. 6 points. Merit, Misty Morning. Simon Smith. Good photographs rely on light or, in its absence, mood. This is a wonderful moody photograph in soft light with nothing in it that doesn't belong. If I was to be picky, lightening the overall photo by no more than 1/3 stop would be my only suggestion. 9 points. Honors. Balls on the roof. Strong contrast and possible over-sharpening of the balls is made more obvious by the out-of-focus foreground element on the left-hand side, which also unbalances the composition. Shallow depth of field is otherwise effective against the background. 1 point. Not accepted, climbing wall pose. This is a really interesting photo, but has color elements not consistent with blue toning under the monochrome definition. Slight cropping of bright areas at the top and bottom of the frame would really tighten an interesting photo. Probably as strong in straight black and white. 1 point. Not accepted, Mersey River by night 2. A good idea and well exposed, but the long exposure necessary to make this photo has worked against you in the evident movement and blurring of the vegetation. The photo would have been much cleaner in composition if the trees on the right-hand edge of frame had been cropped out, and if the full reflection of the central tree had been included. 1 point. Not accepted, ready for landing. Whilst the capture of the cockatoo is well done, there are many processing problems with this photograph. The blotchy sky, from noise reduction perhaps, and the strong contrast shadows and feather detail on the bird are not helping bring out the beauty of the white feathers. The contrast is also bringing out processing halos around the bird feet and body. 1 point. Not accepted, A Second Life. Margaret Sobolewski. Interesting subject matter, but overly tight composition and harsh contrast, with over-sharpening halos evident. Older subjects often benefit from a softer and more subtle use of contrast to indicate age. I wonder if this would be stronger if presented in muted color. 3 points. Acceptance, illuminated. Alan Keeley. Well captured for the night scene. I find this a bit tight in its composition and has a slight lean to the left than can be easily corrected in your processing. 3 points. Acceptance, Mr. B. Smith-esque. Anne Starkey. This portrait is well exposed and processed, but I find the pose a bit stiff. Even with that, the portrait could be improved by adding greater texture to the beard, which is a strong feature of his face. 3 points. Acceptance, on the prowl. Bob Goodwin. A nice capture of the goanna, but it gets lost in the similar tonality and contrast of the foreground and background. If you can soften these and make the goanna stand out more, it will give you a stronger visual result. 3 points. Acceptance, Robert Baden-Smith. A competently photographed portrait of a seemingly reluctant sitter. Face detail could benefit from more contrast. The composition would benefit from a tighter crop to provide stronger emphasis on the face. 3 points. Acceptance, Snow Pandani. Teresa Johnson. This photo would benefit from cropping or getting closer. If the snow detail is the main interest, the textures of fresh snow are a bit lost in the frame and lacking the texture contrast to be strong feature. This photo is an example of where less could be more. 3 points. Acceptance, the Savior. Baden-Smith. The tree is well lit and the sky treatment strong. Compositionally, I think this would have been stronger if all the branches were set against the sky by getting lower, if that was easy to do. A couple of them are a bit lost against the background, which has a similar exposure and sharpness of focus. 3 points. Acceptance, trees in the mist. Gil Hayes. I like the composition and that you have avoided over-sharpening halos in the treatment of the trees. I do believe that this would be a much stronger photo with a stronger contrast that particularly lightens the water amid misty background for increased separation of the trees from their surroundings. 3 points. Acceptance. Old Gan Railway 1. Brad Stagg. Interesting geometrics and strong contrast are effective. An added bonus is the way that this photo's composition shows the nature of the landscape through which the Gan passes. 4 points. Highly commended, Peace Baby. Jenny King. An interesting photo that appealed to me. There are some processing glitches that can be easily corrected, such as the light edge at the bottom of frame. In the Ned, I was wanting a stronger composition, with the hand fully above the dark horizon or fully beneath it, leaving the sky out of the photo, and wondering if it could have been stronger by including all of the model's hair against her back. 4 points. Highly commended. Spirit of Tasmania. Rob Dawkins. A good dusk-night photo that is composed in a pleasing manner. I would like to see a bit more contrast through the photograph, as the bottom half of the photo is lacking the lovely contrast evident on the ferry and the silos. 4 points. Highly commended. The bridge. Tony Sobolewski. Strong geometrics benefit from the strong contrast you have obtained from what looks like a grey overcast sky, benefiting you with shadow detail that would have been lost on a bright day. Well done. 4 points. Highly commended. Planes. Mike Jones. Good. Crisp capture of the bike shows strong panning technique. Seeing signage evident is the background is unavoidable and not a negative factor in my judging this photograph. 6 points. Merit. Dusty play. Teresa Johnson. Wonderful play of light in the dust adds to the storytelling strengths of this photograph. The isolation of the two riders makes for a compelling composition. 9 points. Honors.